If you don't know the members of our next panel, there are three of the top education policy experts, especially on issues of school choice, but more broadly on education generally in Ohio. I'll do a quick introduction, and then we're a little behind schedule, so we'll jump into questions quickly, and I'll try to move even more quickly to audience questions because judging by the last questions, I'm sure a number of folks have questions for them. So the first person is Sarah Peckon-Driver. She works for School Choice Ohio, which is the leading advocate historically for vouchers and private school choice in the state of Ohio, and work to empower parents with information. The next is Greg Harris, who's the State Director of Students First. If that sounds familiar, Students First is a national education group that was founded by Michelle Rhee, former superintendent of DC schools. They are active in all areas of education reform, including school choice. And finally, Larry Keough, who's the head of who is the education person for the Ohio Catholic Conference, has been a key player in a lot of issues related to school choice and vouchers in both the state of Ohio and in his previous position in the state of Florida, which has a vibrant school choice market as well. And if you don't know, I don't think the stat has come out today, approximately 70% of the schools, I believe, give or take, that participate in the state's voucher programs are Catholic schools. So he has a large cadre of his schools participate. All right, without further ado, the first question. Well, clearly the income-based scholarship drew a lot of comments, and so I'd like Sarah Peckon-Driver to talk a little bit about that. What does the income-based scholarship, what does it represent for Ohio, and how does it compare, how do Ohio's choice programs compare nationally in that, we think of like a failing schools model voucher, but in most places, I believe there's more income-based scholarships than others. So comment sort of how this works in Ohio and what the comparison nationally is.
Absolutely. And thank you first to Fordham and to Ellen for your great work and for sparking this conversation. I think there's a lot of great ideas being talked about and important realities of private schools and vouchers. So the income-based scholarship, in school choice we talk about options being limited for parents based on three factors: income, zip code, and disability. And in Ohio for a long time we had the zip code issue being addressed through the Ed Choice Scholarship that allows students from low-rated schools to attend private school. And we had more recently the John Peterson Scholarship. But we still had this income piece where families whose schools maybe aren't in the bottom 10% of schools, but they aren't working for them and aren't a good fit for them, really had no option. And the income-based scholarship has been a huge step forward. And it does match the national landscape in terms of vouchers. Louisiana has a combination income-based and zip code voucher program, and our neighbors in Indiana have an income-based scholarship that is growing really quickly. And I think part of what we heard in the last panel and what the report points to is that the education marketplace is becoming much more of an ecosystem. And we have students that are spending half day in career centers and half day at Youngstown Christian. We have students who are spending part of the day homeschooling and part of the day in whatever other type of, so there's this really interesting and fantastic multi-sector education marketplace that's happening. And I think this is one piece of that. The income-based scholarship allows families to choose among sectors, and what we hope to see is that we'll grow even more in that, allowing families to choose courses, not just schools. And I think that there's some real promising moves in that direction. But even for a school that is excellent rated, there's no school that is the perfect fit for every child. And so for whatever reason, a family may want to choose another option.
Okay, great. Thank you, Sarah. Next question's for Greg. A constant theme in public discourse about vouchers is accountability. And I know Students First has strong views on accountability generally. In your view and your organization's view, is Ohio getting it right? in terms of private school choice accountability?
Not yet. The talk of an education marketplace is something we'd embrace. We'd like to see a school funding system. To your question earlier, where money follows a child regardless of school type, and with weights for certain types of kids. Children from disadvantaged backgrounds face unique barriers to learning. So we would support a weighted student formula that addresses that, addresses English language learners, it addresses special needs. But for something like that to happen, under the current status, you have the traditional public schools, paying the cost of transportation, being held highly accountable now under a new evaluation system, a new report card system. And so we have to have parallel accountability. For this emergent, as Ellen alluded earlier, we have this parallel system of education that's emerging. For it to be truly a marketplace, all schools, regardless of school type, need to be held equally accountable to educating their kids. So a lot of the private schools put a premium on school culture, put a premium on even the faith, instilling faith through that culture. And that is critically important to the families, but for Ohio taxpayers, what has to be of primary importance is that these schools are also succeeding in educating kids. And fortunately, based on this report, the school leaders, none of them are afraid of that accountability. They want their kids held to the same standards as public school students. But yes, we have to create a systematized, equitable accountability system for all schools, not just for traditional public schools.
Okay, thank you, Greg. Larry, with 70% of the schools flying the same banner as you, Catholic schools, Catholic education, and when you talk about voucher accountability, one of the things advocates point to, and it seems common sense, that if you have too many accountability requirements, schools will choose not to participate. So sort of, what is your view? Where is that line? What's appropriate, what isn't?
Well, first of all, we have over 20 years from a historical perspective to look at school choice. I remember back in the mid to late 90s, when I was in Florida, a lot of people said, if you put regulation on non-public schools, they simply will not participate. Or some people said that if they were to participate, then eventually private schools would become mirror images of public schools, and then parents wouldn't have any clear choice because the schools would all kind of blend and be the same. But now, looking back over the last 20 years, that's not the case. I think the litmus test is reasonable accountability. What is reasonable? And from my perspective, what is reasonable is that the state has a vested interest to know if scholarship students are learning a year's worth of knowledge. And how do you do that? You do that through outcome-based accountability, which is testing. I also think that we're at a very critical point in the school choice movement. Only 0.4% of the students in K-12 education in this country are on vouchers. We're basically serving a niche group. I think if we use empirical evidence to drive the school choice movement, we can expand school choice. And what I'm talking about is an apples to apples, oranges to oranges, a longitudinal database where you factor in disabilities, developmental delays, if the families or the kids are under 200%, over 200%, if they're gifted, if they speak English as a second language, and then you compare those kids to their public school counterparts. And you have transparent accountability. And let's also remember, these programs are for families, for parents. And if we have that transparent accountability, then parents can make informed, responsible decisions on what schools truly are in the best to serve their children.
Great, thank you, Larry. Going back to Sarah, now we've heard a little bit about accountability, but one thing that Larry mentioned was information for parents. There's probably no group more in the state that's involved with providing parents information about their educational options than School Choice Ohio. So what additional information do parents need? And if we're going to have more accountability with the state, with private school choice, where would value add? Is that a big missing factor right now in terms of not currently being something that's measured?
Absolutely. We like you said, work with parents very closely. We train them to be savvy school shoppers. So look at what is a high-rated school and then make your shopping list so you can see as a family, does this school offer what is going to make the school a good match for your child? And so then they say to us, okay, how can I find the ratings for the private schools? And we say there aren't any. And that's not helpful for parents. They are looking for information to be able to evaluate their options. The tension there is that we don't want to give, from a systemic point of view, any disincentive for a private school to accept a student as they're doing all across the state who are many grade levels behind. And so if we do something related to performance, we could easily see the private schools saying, okay, now we've got some pressure to stop accepting the kids who are farther behind, and that would be a huge loss for thousands of students across the state. And so to what Chad mentioned, I think value added hits a good sweet spot there because of that. You can look at what progress are the students making. Oftentimes it takes a couple of years to bring students up to grade level if they're coming in behind. And this will give parents a benchmark to say, is your child going to be making academic progress here? Is this school committed to academic rigor? And that will give parents some tools to be able to evaluate that.
Great, thank you. Greg, your organization works across many states. Does anybody have a electronic device, an iPhone on the table? I think that there could be feedback to the mics. I don't know, I'm hearing something. I don't know if everybody else is. Hide your phones. Okay. Sounds like you're good. Okay, never mind. Greg, your organization works all across the country. Ohio has 5 separate voucher programs. Is that too many?
You know what, Sarah and I were actually having this discussion recently, and some of the panelists mentioned earlier that there is a amount of paperwork that potentially could be streamlined. Perhaps the application process could be streamlined. I know what we were discussing yesterday was sometimes Cleveland voucher recipients face artificial barriers if they want to transfer to a school outside the city limits. I think we'd be very open to be participating in a process, working with school leaders to see if there's a way to streamline maybe a common application and maybe try to lower some of the red tape for the schools.
Okay, great. All right, the last question I'll ask is for Larry, and then we'll let you guys go ahead and jump in with questions again. Larry, I'm going to actually follow up on the gentleman from Bishop Hartley's question on voucher funding amounts. I know you've been a leading advocate and proponent for making sure the voucher amount was fair, was equitable, and made sense in terms of the school dynamics, being that K-8 is cheaper than high school. So what are your thoughts on what Ohio could or should do related to voucher funding amounts?
Well, thank you, Chad. I believe that probably all of us in this room would probably say that by and large, most of the participating schools are serving the voucher scholarship students well. And if we do have a resounding yes to that, then the next question would be, let's make sure that the present providers can stay in the program and that we can also reach out to other potential providers. Some of you may know that the EdChoice scholarship statute was enacted in 2005. At that time, the average tuition in K-8 Catholic schools was well below the scholarship amount of $4,250. And at the high school level, the average tuition at that time was in the 6,000 range, about 6,500, maybe a little bit below that. Now, fast forward to 2014. A lot of our K-8 schools, the tuition is right up against $4,250. In many instances, it has surpassed $4,250. At the high school level, the average high school tuition is now about $8,600, $8,700. We know that there are tuition rates at some Catholic schools that exceed $10,000, $11,000. Now consider that you are participating in the EdChoice program at the high school level, to Ken Clare's point earlier. And let's say you've enrolled 100 EdChoice scholarship students. The scholarship amount's $5,000. The tuition, let's say, nice round even number of $9,000. That computes to $400,000 in unfunded tuition. Now, how does a school make that up? It's extremely difficult. And sometimes what schools do is, oftentimes what they do, is they raise tuition, and it has to be raised on the backs of paying parents, tuition-paying parents. Well, that creates all kinds of problems, as you could imagine. So I think going forward, what we want to be able to do is say, let's allow these providers to be able to sustain in the program. You know, most of the schools, I think, that participate do so through some sort of altruistic motivation. They want to reach out to children in need, or who are disadvantaged, or need another educational opportunity. But let's remember that you have to meet operating costs. And to some extent, you have to use a business model. Can you imagine a small business where on an annual basis, they're in the fiscal red of $400,000? What you would say is that's not sustainable. And I think that's what we're saying, that I want to speak for a moment on behalf of the Catholic schools in Ohio. I think to every school, they want to continue to participate. And I think we're mission-driven in many, many respects. But this has to work fiscally, and I think there needs to be some adjustments in the scholarship amounts for the providers to continue.
Great. Well, I've teed up a lot of issues for you guys. If you want to move to the microphone and ask some more questions. Mr. Phillips?
I've heard this morning that about mission. I've heard about proselyting. Just as a little background, I'm on a children's home board. It's a religiously oriented board. I'm on a camp board. In fact, president of the camp board is religiously oriented. I'm a leader in my congregation. I'm on a private university board, which is has a religious orientation. And the reason that I spend my time on all of these boards, and including the congregation where I serve, is because I want to propagate my faith. Now, I don't want public money to propagate my faith. When church and state get too cozy, both church and state lose. And I'm just concerned, and I would pose the question, are you concerned about, particularly Larry, are you concerned about your faith being watered down as a result of accepting this public money? The other question that I have is, Ohio's charter school law is certainly weak in terms of accountability and transparency. Private corporations have hijacked the concept, the original concept, and I guess the question is, what are we going to do in this state to make the charter school industry accountable and transparent? So the two questions then, one to Greg particularly, what are we going to do to tighten up charter school? The whole concept of charter schools has been hijacked for profit. And then, do any of you worry in the choice movement about both church and state losing as a result of this growing cozy relationship between church and state, notwithstanding the Supreme Court decision, but just on a philosophical basis?
Okay, so I'll let the panelists jump in just a moment. Just to clarify for the audience, what Mr. Phillips is referring to on the charter schools or community schools are public schools. Those are their charter schools, not private schools at most of this topic. I just wanted to make sure we drew those lines. Greg's more than capable of answering that question, so he can do it. I just want to make sure the audience is aware of the difference between the private schools participating in a voucher program and charter schools.
But I would add, though, Chad, that charter schools are public in the law. However, what's public about them is public money, not public governance, not public accountability in most cases.
Yeah, I
So
was
there
just
is-
differentiating it from our report.
Right.
That's all. That's fine. Larry, you want to start with the coziness question?
Well, as I said a few moments ago, we have over 20 years of history in the school choice movement. And I remember 20 years ago that question being asked, Bill, and there were a lot of concerns. I know in Catholic schools, the last thing we would want to do is compromise our religious mission. It's who we are, it's what we're about. There's faith formation. I am not aware of any evidence that in the past 20 years, school choice has somehow compromised our religious identity and our ability to provide a faith-based education. For some of you may not know that there was a U.S. Supreme Court decision in the Lemon case years ago. I know Chad is very aware of this. And what the Lemon case said was that there's 3 prongs to determine if a voucher program is constitutional. One, it would have to be religious neutral. To Mike's point in the former panel discussion, the primary effect of school choice needs to be the academics to provide a quality education to scholarship students. So that's number 1. Number 2, it must have a secular purpose. And number 3, and I think this is your point, Bill, the state or the government cannot excessively entangle itself into the affairs of a religious entity, i.e. a parochial school. I can tell you, I think your question is very legitimate. I think it's always on our minds. I just don't see any evidence of it heretofore. And I think going forward that because we have this 20-year historical perspective, we've laid the groundwork for these programs to continue, serve students well, and not compromise our religious mission.
Okay.
I could speak to it anecdotally. 2 people very close to me, one who's Indian, raised Hindu, but attended Catholic schools in Toledo, and another one who's Jewish and attended Mercy Montessori in Cincinnati. But there, when I would talk to them, and this can't be anecdotal, we have to look at this systemically, but that as one of the panelists mentioned, you educate all the kids, but not all the kids participate in the religious sacraments and the ceremony. And there are ways that you can be that you can do this uniquely. I don't want to devote a lot of time unique to the students. I don't want to devote a lot of time to charters because this is not about charter schools, but the bargain for charters was that they were supposed to get ultimate flexibility in return for greater accountability. The charters were given the flexibility without accountability to date. So there are a lot of charter schools that are not fulfilling their mission, not even on par with the public schools that the district averages, and those kinds of schools need to be closed. There are some charter schools that are not going to ball out of the park, and I know our organization would like to see those schools scaled up. That's my answer in short.
Great. We have reached time, and I want to respect the audience's time, so anybody who wants to leave, please feel no guilt. If someone else wants to ask a question, I think Ann has a question, please go ahead and feel free to do that. Just if you need to gather your stuff and leave quietly, please feel free to do so.
As Chad knows, I don't need a microphone. I'm in the middle. I'm with the Northwest Ohio Scholarship Fund to meet the scholarship in Northwest Ohio. My question is, what is it going to take to change the way of thinking that the money belongs to the public schools and is not for the benefit of the child's education?
Go ahead, Larry.
Well, thank you for the question, Ann. Actually, it's a question that I have struggled with for a long time. We need to make these programs work for the families, meaning the families who are recipients of state-sponsored scholarships. But it also needs to work for the state, the common good, and needs to work for the school districts. Probably you and I and many others in this room have had tireless conversations, Jason, Sarah, School Choice of Ohio, Fordham, about how to make these programs funded in a way that there's not this adverse fiscal impact on the school districts. And as much as we champion the John Peterson, we advocated for it, we've worked very closely with Sue and the ODE, there were some kinks in that program. We know that in the state of Ohio that some districts receive $1,000, $500 in some instances in state aid. Suddenly there's this deduct coming out that could be up to $20,000. I mean, that is a real hit for districts. So I think as we go forward, we need to be cognizant, I think we are, trying to adjust our thinking on the funding mechanisms to make it fair and equitable for all concerned.
And just to add to Larry's point, Ann, I mean, one of the things that's easy to discount are the complexities of our state's funding system. The reason a district may only get $500 is because of their high property wealth. So yes, those are local tax dollars in that they were levied. Many of them are levied as required by state law because they're under a certain millage. So, you know, taxpayers didn't go to vote on that. It's allocated everywhere. It just goes into the district's coffers immediately instead of going to the state first like in some states do. So it gets so complicated in the funding mechanisms, and that's part of what I think makes this so tricky to solve. There's good people on both sides of the argument trying to work for something, and I think, you know, that will be a continued, as school choice has proven it to expand, that's going to be a continued tension point until we can find the right answer to it, and the answer may very well be in some way in the future simplifying our funding system.
You know, the premise of your question is well received. I mean, you know, we ultimately want to get to a system where money follows the child, and you know, we need to talk to people like Professor DeLuca and how you accomplish that. But I think a critical key point is that all students are held, that the accountability system transcends school type, and we have to get the accountability mechanisms in place, and then we can get to a formula where money follows individuals, not institutions.
In Professor DeLuca's defense, about 7 years ago maybe, she, in a project funded by the Fordham Foundation, published a pamphlet like this one called Funding the Child, where the money follows from the state, follows the child wherever the child goes. So she has worked on it.
Mr. Phillips, did you have another question?
Yeah, this whole idea of money following the child is antithetical to the Constitution of the state of Ohio. Article 6, Section 2 says that the General Assembly shall make such provisions by taxation or otherwise as will secure a thorough and efficient system of common schools throughout the state. The money was, by Constitution, was to go to the institution, the public district, the common school district. I mean, that historically.
I'd like to speak to that. The weighted student funding model and Fund the Child model, probably its biggest impact would be in the public system. There have been studies done that show that the biggest inequities are, in terms of school funding, are not between districts but are within districts, because the funding is going to the institution of the district and it's being allocated based on teacher preferences and teacher tenure. And the students who need the most help and the best teachers, and the way that students can be educated is through excellent teachers, and are receiving much lower per student funding rates even within the districts. And that is, I think, one of the biggest tragedies of our current system here in Ohio, and weighting student funding would address that.
Well, if I may, the state is responsible for a thorough and efficient system, and if there's a problem within the system, then the state has a responsibility to fix it. We have an unconstitutional school funding system today, and after from 2003 this way, it's continued to be unconstitutional. That's because the state legislature and the governors have not fixed the system. And if there's a problem of distribution within a district, then it's still the state's responsibility to fix the system, not to farm it out.
All right, any additional questions? Great, we want to thank you all for coming. A round of applause for our panelists.